Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Judy Cho, and I am board certified in holistic nutrition. I work with clients to get to root cause healing, and oftentimes that starts with gut healing with a meat-based elimination diet. So today I am so excited to share this interview with you guys. I have always been intrigued by genetically modified foods ever since I went to UC Berkeley, and I just was questioning everything that wasn't organic. And I feel like I've come full circle because I had a career in between and then I just came back to nutrition. But it was so fascinating to interview Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is an MIT scientist and she just got intrigued by glyphosate because she had a friend that had a child with autism and they were going down rabbit holes to figure out what happened. I'll let her share the journey in our interview, but it's such a fascinating one. I hope this conversation helps you to understand that plant-based foods are not only toxic because of plant toxins. In Carnivore Cure's Chapter 5, I talk about all things glyphosate. The thing about plants are that whether it's organic, whether it's non-GMO, or it is GMO, they are all affected in some amounts by glyphosate and other herbicides, pesticides, insecticides. Even organic plant foods use a lot of stuff to ensure that other bugs do not kill off these plants. Sometimes if you're really sick, it may just be better to focus on meat where you are protected by the own animal's biology that will help you be healthier than eating the most highest quality organic plant-based foods. If you aren't feeling well on a paleo type of diet or a whole foods diet that includes a lot of plants, you may want to just remove the plants just because of the exposure to herbicides and other plant toxins and toxins that are sprayed on our crops. Listen to this discussion and you'll see a lot more of what I've been advocating for that is concerning about plant foods other than anti-nutrients. Let's get right into the discussion. Hi, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. I'm so excited to have you on. I have been looking into glyphosate and GMO since my college years. And so I'm really excited to finally speak to an expert. For those of the people that are listening and watching that don't know you, do you mind introducing yourself?
Certainly, yes. I'm Stephanie Seneff. I work at MIT. I've been at MIT all my entire career as well as my education. So I have several degrees from MIT, bachelor's in biology, master's EE and Ph.D. degrees in computer science and electrical engineering. I spent all my life working for MIT. I'm now a senior research scientist, which is the highest rank on the research staff.
What got you interested in glyphosate? Why glyphosate? Why does it even matter?
Right. Well, that was a long journey, and it began really a long time ago in early 1980s when my best friend at the time had a son who got a DPT shot, had a bad reaction, and was later diagnosed with severe autism. So it sort of planted a seed in my mind, linking vaccines to autism, which I know is a very controversial topic. And so I was just curious about autism because of that and sort of watching it. And I saw the rates going up in the 2000s, 2005, 2006, 2007, every year rates going up. And they're always saying, oh, well, we're just diagnosing it more. Don't worry about it. It's a genetic disease. And it just didn't make sense to me that rates kept going up. So I wanted to figure out what was causing the increase in autism. I thought, well, I'm a scientist. I can do correlation studies. Let me take a look at various chemicals in the environment and see if I can find something that's going up dramatically. And certainly the vaccines are a candidate, and they have gone up dramatically since 1986. So I don't rule them out, and I do think they're a factor. But after 5 years of looking, I didn't think the vaccines were the primary factor. I thought there was something else, and I didn't know what it was. And I was frustrated. So that was kind of the situation I was in. I knew a lot about autism at that point. I'd read many papers about it. Very complicated disease, lots of comorbidities, gut problems, mineral deficiencies and mineral toxicities, all kinds of things. So I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber was giving a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. This was 2012, in the fall of 2012. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I didn't know what glyphosate was, but I thought, well, this looks interesting. I probably should attend this talk. And I was just spellbound. I mean, his talk was so perfect because the things he described that glyphosate does were things that I do were factors in autism. It just fit like hand in glove. I was so impressed. And I came away from that really with an epiphany. I really felt like this is it. Particularly because glyphosate is so pervasive. It's considered to be so safe. People use it in their yards with their children playing there. They don't think it's a problem. It's all over the food supply. It's in the air. It's in the water. It's the most used herbicide on the planet in the United States, uses more per person than any other country in the world. And we have very high rates of autism. So it all kind of fit together. And later on, Nancy Swanson did stuff. She introduced herself to me and said, hey, I saw your paper, because I'd written a paper linking glyphosate to autism, just theoretically and arguing all the reasons, and based on Don Huber's work and then other people's work as well. And Nancy came across our paper and sent me an email and said, I'm doing some analyses and look at this. And it was basically autism matches perfectly with glyphosate. If you look at the rates of autism in first grade in the United States, versus in the public schools, versus the use of glyphosate over the previous 4 years. So that would be like the age of 2 to the age of 6 in the child's life. You take those two plots and you put them on the same page and they coincide. It's like a 0.99 correlation coefficient. It's absolutely stunning. And, people say, well, correlation doesn't mean causation. And then they say, well, how could, and of course, then we went on to find all kinds of other diseases. How could one chemical cause so many diseases? I refused to give up. I mean, I just felt like we were onto something really huge here. And I've been like a bulldog ever since then, just studying everything I can about glyphosate and these diseases and looking for these correlations and then explanations, finding the biological mechanism. So it's been quite a journey. It's been a wonderful puzzle. And I feel like I've really kind of cracked the code with that book. And so I'm very pleased with what I've discovered. And at the same time, terrified, yes, toxic legacy. How the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment, just published July 1st by Chelsea Green. And I'm continuing to look into glyphosate as we speak.
Yeah, I came across one of your discussions. I believe it was in front of the Congress, right? Or the
2016, when we went to the U.S. government, and right. Mm-hmm. Can
you talk a little bit about, you bring up these facts about kids, 1 in 3 is overweight, 1 in 6 have learning disabilities. And it was such a powerful information that I read. And then I put some of the charts that you're mentioning in my actual book that I published last year. And can you
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. And thank you for your book too. It's wonderful. But can you talk a little bit about these illnesses and how glyphosate affects, our children?
Right. I mean, that's critical. And I think it is I think it's the primary factor, as I said, in a huge list of diseases, and including things like sleep disorder. I've seen, we have striking correlations. I've published papers where we show perfect correlation with sleep disorder, which is another thing that's really become rampant lately. And it wasn't really an issue back when I was young, and depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, they're all going up dramatically in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. And it's funny how we sort of get used to the new normal. I feel like people just expect that their children are going to have all these behavior issues and they're going to be, super excitable. Like they just break down crying at the store because their parents won't let them buy the toy. I mean, the kids behave very differently today. They seem very nervous and anxious. And I feel like, it's affecting all the children in a bad way. And of course, there's obesity too. And obesity is very clear. It's quite dramatic if you look at Africa. I did write a chapter for a book on glyphosate. Well, it was a book on toxic chemicals in agriculture. And my chapter was on glyphosate use in Africa. And I was quite surprised when I looked at statistics on African obesity because it divides extremely well. There's a big gap. There's a bunch of countries that have very low obesity rates, and then a few countries that have very high obesity rates. And the high obesity is basically South Africa and the Mediterranean shoreline. Those are the countries with obesity. The rest of the middle don't have it. And it's also the way glyphosate divides up as well. They use much less glyphosate in Africa than they do here. Right. But South Africa is an exception. They early on, they introduced glyphosate resistant corn, maize. And so that's a big crop that they have. And they use a lot of glyphosate in South Africa, and they have an obesity problem there, along with diabetes, all the things that go with it, heart disease. So we have it in spades. In this country, we're so sick, and it's just really sad to look around and see. I wish people could know what it was like when I was a child, because There are people around all the time today that you see that you don't blink twice about, that we would have gawked over just because they were so big. Back then, we wouldn't see people like that. Now they're normal, practically normal. I mean, it's just quite interesting how we adjust. Autism, oh yeah, of course, lots of kids have autism. That's not a problem somehow because it's acknowledged as this is just the way it is.
Right.
We can't seem to get past that,
Right. Or like food allergies or sensitivities. Exactly. Now it's just normal.
It's crazy with the peanut allergies. Kids can't take a peanut butter sandwich to school because the kid next door is going to die from just breathing the peanut butter that's in their sandwich.
Right. And that's so crazy. That's why all the airlines, they switched over from peanuts to grains. And I mean, ironically, but yes. Just playing devil's advocate, how do we know that it's just not that we're eating too many processed foods that have carbohydrates in the seed oils that make people eat more foods and, cause their insulin to not really understand that we need to stop eating. And instead it's just causing more insulin resistance. How do we know that it's specifically the glyphosate in those products that are causing it?
We don't know that for sure, but we do get a lot of contradictory studies where people are looking at the role of fats, and they'll use omega-6 fats. And one study will find that they're fine. Another study will find that they're terrible. And we're getting all these inconsistent results. My suspicion is that that's because they're not looking at the levels of glyphosate in the fats that they're exposing the animals to. I think that the processed food is a problem. I will not deny that. And I think in particular, you lose a lot of the really interesting molecules that are in the plants. I really believe in eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, and even lightly cooked or raw vegetables, eating a salad every day. I really believe in that. The vegetables have wonderful molecules in them, the polyphenols, the flavonoids, the terpenoids. These are complicated molecules. They actually come out of the shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts. So when the plants are exposed to glyphosate, they produce less of these miracle molecules, actually, that are really, really good for your mitochondria. They handle the oxidative stress. I mean, they're very, very important as a health benefit. And when you take those foods, irrespective of the glyphosate, and you turn them into basically chemicals, you've got pure sugar and pure flour and salt and oil, right? Vegetable oil extracted from nuts. And then you put those together and make, soy protein bars. I mean, you make these synthetic foods that are mostly chemicals, and then you call that a food. Well, you've lost all of those valuable molecules through that processing. We have this concept of, fats and carbs and protein, fats, and carbs as the three basic sources of food for energy. But we're missing out on all of those really special molecules that are not fats, not carbs, and not proteins. We're missing them when we eat only these processed foods.
I focus on a meat-based diet as an elimination diet to kind of figure out what are some of the root causes for a lot of my clients in my community. But with that said, one of the reasons, I know there's a lot of people that say we shouldn't be eating plants because of the anti-nutrients like oxalates, lectins, phytates. And there's truth in that too, but it doesn't affect everyone. When I was doing the research on glyphosate and looking into your information as well, the part that for me made it even a further reason not to touch as many plants, especially if you have autoimmune and you're unwell, is because a lot of the places where they have the organic plants are also next to the plants that are GMO that are using the glyphosate, and then it travels in the air and it travels in the water. And so I think it's almost impossible for the organic plants not to get some sort of exposure to these GMO or glyphosate, sprayed toxins. And so it makes it easier that if we know that it's kind of everywhere and it's pervasive, it's being sprayed in our neighbors' yards, if we don't eat some of those plants, then we won't get affected as much by the glyphosate that may be also in plants. And so therefore, if you just eat meat, then maybe that reduces some of your exposure. And then on top of that, even if you eat some of, let's say, the grain-fed cows, the fact that there was this one study that I saw that said, if you have sufficient, I think, aromatic amino acids, you may be able to block some of the antimicrobial effects of glyphosate. If we eat sufficient meat and then we do get exposed to some of the glyphosate, will we be protected because of those aromatic amino acids?
Well, I do think it's a good idea to eat a lot of foods that have aromatic amino acids to buffer them against the loss because of the glyphosate exposure, because you're in, as you know, the gut microbes produce aromatic amino acids for the host. Our cells are incompetent. They can't make those important molecules. And those are, the part of the coating, the basic building blocks of proteins, but they're also precursors to an incredible number of important biologically active molecules. And I talk about that in my book. But the pathway that makes aromatics is blocked by glyphosate. It's used in many microbes in our gut to make them for the host. Those microbes get affected because they're basically getting killed because they can't make them. They're essential for them as well. And then we get an imbalance in the gut microbiome. We get all this inflammation and the immune cells come in, and we get a lot of trouble with gut dysbiosis, gut damage, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel, all these different irritable bowel disease, acid reflux. There's a whole bunch of gut problems that we suffer from today that I think are directly tied to the chronic exposure of our gut microbes to glyphosate. Right. And the aromatics are precursors for serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, melanin, the skin tanning agent, epinephrine. So all of these really important hormones and the protection from the sun, all of those things come out of that shikimate. Also thyroid hormones. So all of them come out of that shikimate pathway. All of them are going to be insufficient in the context of glyphosate chronically poisoning our gut microbes. So certainly you want to try to, even, people are taking a lot of aminos as supplements these days, which I find interesting. You can get sort of a complex of aminos in general or specific amino acids. Glycine, of course, is a big one because that's the one that glyphosate is really messing up in the proteins. So, people, I think it's ironic. People are taking individual amino acids. It's like your food already digested. We should be able to eat proteins, including, wheat protein, and casein and gluten are both very problematic for so many people. Yeah. And they have a lot of proline, and proline is difficult to break down. And the enzymes that the microbes in the gut have that help you break down the proteins that contain a lot of proline are disrupted by glyphosate. And so that those proteins don't get broken down, they stick around, and then they cause autoimmune disease by virtue of being a foreign protein. So we're getting a lot of these autoimmune diseases through molecular mimicry because of proteins that we're eating that are not getting properly digested. I think that's all caused by glyphosate too. And then we're taking all these amino acids because we're essentially eating our food already digested, because we can't break it down. Because we get then a deficiency of amino acids at the same time because we're not able to supply ourselves. And then those proteins get into the lower gut, and that causes a lot of problems too. That causes this basic pH because the microbes in the colon break down the proteins that were not broken down earlier. They should have been broken down and absorbed in the midgut. That didn't happen because the glyphosate disrupted the microbes. And then those proteins end up intact in the lower gut. And that's where these other microbes are able to break down the proteins and fully break them down and release nitrogen, which is very basic. So you end up with a pH that's too high in the gut. And then that high pH disrupts a whole bunch of microbes that need to live in a lower pH. And now you get a deficiency in short chain fatty acids, which the microbes would have gotten for you from the fiber that you eat. So the fiber doesn't get properly digested. You don't have enough of these really, really important short chain fatty acids. There's inadequate nutrition in that regard as well. So there's just a lot of things that go wrong because of glyphosate poisoning the gut microbes.
That's so interesting because a lot of the carnivores or a lot of the meat only dieters that I do a stool test, their short chain fatty acids look pretty good. And I wonder if it's because since they're not eating a lot of the plants that would even disrupt, eating the glyphosate rich plants that may disrupt the microbiome that would affect any of the short chain fatty acids are not really present. So therefore, whatever amounts they get from the meats and the butters and the butyrate from that. So then it can, even if it's smaller amounts compared to if you eat plant fibers, it's enough and there's less of the toxins coming in. So you can have a healthy gut microbiome. And that actually makes a lot of sense. I always thought about just the aromatic amino acids because of the shikimate pathway, but I realized it affects a lot more than that. I never correlated that tryptophan, is a precursor to serotonin, which then would affect your sleep. And And
That's
because
right. That's how
serotonin
you get the
produces
sleep and the
melatonin.
depression.
Yeah,
Depression is
I never
also
thought
linked to
about that.
serotonin deficiency. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, why, if glyphosate is so bad for us? And I think it's because of the scientists use like the LD50 rule and how human cells don't get affected, and that's why therefore it's safe. Can you, explain
Yes.
why we thought this was safe when it actually is not for, especially our bacteria or our gut microbiome cells?
You're right. And also for our own cells, it turns out. And of course, there's plenty of studies now that are showing that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. And that's kind of an interesting story,
Right.
because back when glyphosate was being studied by Monsanto, the maker of glyphosate, they're the people who own the patent, they're the ones who sell it. They did studies back in the 1970s on animal studies, and in vitro studies and things like that. And they made up some rules for those studies. And one thing they said was that if you test a chemical at a higher level of concentration and you don't find any evidence of toxicity, you don't need to test it at any lower level than that. That's kind of the lower limit. Everything lower is fine. That was an important rule. They said another rule was if you test an animal for 3 months, you expose it to glyphosate for 3 months, and you don't see any obvious problems, then that's fine. You don't have to look 4 months. It's long enough. So they defined a time limit, and they defined it, this rule that if you didn't see the toxicity at higher levels, well, it turns out endocrine disruptors have this famous property that they're much toxic at very low levels than they are at higher levels. And so they didn't know that glyphosate was an endocrine disruptor, and they weren't going to find out because they didn't study it at those lower levels. Right. But it was really not until Seralini had published his paper just before I found out about glyphosate through that talk that I heard. So it was really quite wonderful. I came home from that talk, and one of the first things I read was this paper by Seralini's group in France, where they exposed rats to low doses of glyphosate for their entire lifespan. And they monitored them all. So they went way beyond the 3 months. Okay. And then it was low dose. It was way below the minimum that they thought was problematic. It was actually below regulatory limits. So very reasonable, expected, environmental situations with this exposure. And by 3 months, the rats all looked fine. You really couldn't tell the difference between the exposed ones and the unexposed ones. By 4 months, they started to show problems. And by the end of their lifespan, they had lots of problems. The females had massive mammary tumors. The males had obvious kidney and liver damage. Both genders had various issues with the reproductive system, and they had early death. So it was very clear it was causing problems, but it took a long time, right. And it was low dose. And so that was 2012. That paper got retracted because of pressure from the industry, and then it got republished. So it still exists as a legitimate publication in its republished form. And that opened eyes. And I think since then, and especially in the last few years, there have been many papers coming out showing glyphosate toxicity at very low levels. It's really been quite a watershed moment, because it's taken that. Before 2012, there were no studies that looked at glyphosate at low dose, because it was like, what's the point? We've already shown it's not toxic at high dose, so how is it going to be toxic at low dose? So that really changed the picture. So now we've got a lot of really exciting papers, and even showing when you expose a pregnant mouse or a pregnant rat, I think it was mice, to low dose glyphosate, such that there was no obvious damage to the pregnant mouse. There was no obvious damage to the offspring. Right. The offspring grew up and they had pups, and then they grew up and they had pups, and you started to see worse and worse situations with each generation, down to like the third generation. It was quite remarkable. Wow. Various problems that came up in the later generations only because of that exposure in the great-great-grandmother during pregnancy. So that's another thing that's become known, is that, and they know how to do these studies now. They know exactly which window, during the pregnancy to expose them, to catch that moment when it's going to really disrupt the germline, because the female embryo makes her own future generation eggs very early, before she even has a brain. It's quite interesting. And that's a very sensitive period. And there's a very strong likelihood for toxicity in the pregnant mom to show up, to get to the embryo and cause memory of this toxic situation that uses epigenetics to modify things long-term, and that can last through many generations. It's really quite remarkable.
So if I heard you correctly, if the first exposure happened, let's say in your great-grandmother's, and you don't really get exposed from your mother, you could still be affected.
Right. It
Wow.
was just from that exposure way back when. There was no more exposure. They were just growing the mice in the lab through the generations, and
Wow.
they got this result. So it's quite remarkable.
Wow. Can you talk a little about the farming? So there are some people that'll say, "Oh, these are just mice, and the crops are just the glyphosate is sprayed just while they're harvesting." But it's actually also used at the very end. It's also in our parks, in our schoolyards, and everywhere. And we just talked about how long it can last in the soil if you've done that research. So if your kid stomps on the floor, they're breathing in the glyphosate. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is it true that at the very end of farming, that the practices for these GMO products, they just sprayed at the end so that the crops will dry like a week faster so that they can push it to market?
Yeah, so actually that's the non-GMO crops, which is really quite interesting because people think,
Okay.
oh, I'm buying GMO, I'm buying
Oh.
non-GMO, that's safe. That's what they're thinking, right?
Oh,
As
wow.
long as I look for that non-GMO label, I'm okay. That's not true. And in fact, the highest levels are showing up on non-GMO crops that are sprayed routinely right before harvest to kill them. So if it's GMO, it's got the protection, so you can't use it as in that way.
Wow. Okay.
But so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point to make that it's the non-GMO crops that are sometimes the most dangerous. And in fact, a friend of mine, Tony Mitra, has been harassing his government in Canada for many years to get them to test different foods for glyphosate. Our government doesn't bother to test because it's perfectly safe. We know it's in there. We don't care. That's their attitude.
Sure.
He got Canada to do a big study where they tested thousands of different food samples for glyphosate, including Canadian grown foods, as well as imports from the US, from Europe, from Mexico. And he published a book called Poison Foods of North America based on their findings. It was quite interesting because they consistently found much higher levels of glyphosate in food sourced from Canada or the United States compared to Europe. And interestingly, Mexico came up pretty much aligned with Europe. So if in doubt, buy Mexican, which is kind of funny because we always think Mexican. Yeah. Yes. So US and Canada are very fond of glyphosate, and their levels are reflecting that. And also they found the highest levels is consistently in surprising family, which is the legumes, the chickpeas, the garbanzo beans, hummus, for example, extremely high levels of glyphosate. Those are sprayed right before harvest as a desiccant, as you said correctly. And the wheat is also in the oats and the barley. So you get a lot of glyphosate in oat-based cookies and cereals. So like Cheerios and oatmeal.
Right.
And Oreo cookies and goldfish crackers. The goldfish crackers is probably the wheat. So wheat, oats, and then these beans, these peas and beans. Those are the highest levels in the Canadian products. And then, for example, honey, there's been several papers on honey finding glyphosate in almost all the honey that you can test. But there was a paper that did a lot of honey samples from various places, certainly across the Americas, and even maybe Europe too. I don't remember, but the ones in the United States clearly showed up as the highest, consistently the highest levels. Even in the organic honeys, they also had glyphosate, but at much lower levels. But the highest levels were in the American honeys, which is sad because honeys are really a healthy source of sugar,
Yeah, it's funny. There was a beekeeper that said it's ridiculous when people say that my honey is 100% organic because you can't dictate where
you can't keep your bees away from those. Don't go over there. They've been sprayed.
Right, exactly.
And of course, I think the bee colony collapse syndrome. I think glyphosate's a major player, probably the most important player in bee colony collapse syndrome. We've got the insecticides that are also contributing, and a lot of people are pointing the finger at them, correctly so, probably. But glyphosate disrupts enzymes in the liver that detoxify the chemicals that are in the insecticides. So they work synergistically. When you've got the glyphosate in the bee, then its liver can't detoxify the insecticides.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's a synergistic toxicity that wipes out the bees. And I think if you got rid of the glyphosate, you'd see a pretty big improvement on the bee situation, which is devastating because we're going to have a huge problem with many crops when we don't have bees to pollinate them.
If you were to eat plants, then what are your recommendations? So you just said that garbanzo beans, which is like some of the legumes, the wheats, the oats, some of those are revered as the best fibrous food.
Right.
So
It's quite interesting that people are so concerned about, and I guess people have learned that you need to eat fiber, and that will help you to get the short chain fatty acids, which are so good for your gut. Because as you probably know, the colonocytes love butyrate. That's their favorite food. And butter is a super good source of butyrate. So I really push butter. I think organic butter is one of the best things. In fact, when we use oils for cooking, we use butter or organic lard. Those are our two favorite oils. Which is interesting because both of them, of course, have cholesterol, which is what people are always trying to avoid by switching over to vegetable oils. I think the vegetable oils are definitely inferior, even in the absence of glyphosate considerations. But the seed oils many of them are sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. So you've got the glyphosate in the vegetable oils. You're right, probably more so than you would have in the animal-based. Although the animals, of course, are eating a lot of glyphosate too. They have much higher limits. And the cows are quite sick. And I've read papers about the cows. In fact, a very interesting paper by some Europeans. They found the cows were sick and they tested the glyphosate, found high levels of glyphosate in their urine. And they treated them with bentonite clay, fulvic acid, humic acid, and sauerkraut juice, which was very interesting. The sauerkraut juice really caught my eye. And apparently that was effective. They found that it lowered the levels in their urine and improved their health. That particular treatment regimen that they had figured out, I'm sure, experimentally. But the sauerkraut juice, I find that very fascinating because that's basically a fermented food.
Right.
And Acetobacter is a very common microbe that shows up in fermented foods. And there are very few microbes that can metabolize glyphosate. It has a complicated CP bond that most species don't know how to break that CP bond. And so it's an unusual bond. And but Acetobacter they have an enzyme that can break that CP bond and therefore can turn glyphosate into a nutrient source of both energy and phosphorus and nitrogen. So it becomes a food to them. But it also clears the glyphosate from your body. So I find that really interesting. And I picked up on that, and I've been advocating either sauerkraut or any kind of fermented foods, and apple cider vinegar in particular, because that's also got Acetobacter. So
that's interesting.
The recommendation that I have to people is to eat fermented foods for the reason that those microbes could be breaking down the glyphosate, which is the best you can do. So other things are binders. They'll bind to the glyphosate and take it out through the feces, but then it's still there. It's not in your body. It's now in the feces. And of course, the cows probably have lots of glyphosate in their manure. And that's a problem. Manure is such a valuable thing for fertilizer, but it gets ruined by the diet that these CAFO cows consume.
Yeah, that's and that I agree with. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's and it makes sense. So the bentonite clay and the fulvic acid, all of those will be binders, and it'll help to remove some of the toxins. And then, like you said, with that specific strain, that makes a lot of sense in why they would give that support to then help the animals. If I were to pick what's the worst poison of having organic plants that may be near glyphosate sprayed crops, or having grain fed, which ate the crops, the logic for me was always, well, if the animals have an abundance of the aromatic amino acids, maybe they're a little bit safer than eating. I don't know if you've done any.
But there is a level of indirect. I mean, I feel like if you're eating a crop that was sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest, you're pretty much asking for trouble, right? Whereas if the cow is eating a lot of glyphosate, but most of it does go out. I mean, Monsanto has said that it does accumulate in the tissues. That's something they lied about because they know it. They actually found it experimentally, but in small amounts. Most of it comes in and goes out through the urine, through the feces. So if you're eating an animal, then that's a filter that should get rid of a lot of it, I would think. So I would think in general, a strict animal-based diet, everything else being equal, would have lower glyphosate exposure than a plant-based diet.
Most of the animal-based advocates are arguing about the anti-nutrients, but this is I think the bigger issue, right? It's even if you eat organic plants, if they're next to the glyphosate, or if we are exposed by our neighbors spraying the Roundup in their lawn, and it's also in our schools and our parks. And I put a graphic in my book about, where they spray it everywhere in the cities that have the most glyphosate usage. And I think that's a bigger concern than some of the anti-nutrients that may be affecting only some people. This affects everybody, and it's in our waters. And the more exposure you get, the less optimal health you will have. And I know in your book, you mentioned how glyphosate affects our brain and our neurotransmitters. So can you talk a little bit about, do you think that some of this glyphosate is affecting our mental health that's skyrocketing
Absolutely.
right now?
Absolutely. I think all of those diseases that are going up dramatically in step with glyphosate are caused by glyphosate. And I have to always say glyphosate is not the only cause. We had autism before glyphosate. Right. So people say, how could it be glyphosate? Because we had autism before. I don't think that denies it at all, because there's plenty of different things that cause the same disease. You know, Alzheimer's is another one, which is really scary to me because that's been dramatically rising. Just like autism, really rising exponentially and coming in younger and younger ages over time. And I think glyphosate is a major player in Alzheimer's disease as well. So that's really, and also Parkinson's. And there's studies that show that the farmers using glyphosate have increased risk to Parkinson's disease. And even there was a study on worms that was more than one, I think, but one in particular I'm remembering on worms that was quite interesting. I wrote about it in my book. Where these earthworms, and they had them, and they grew crops in these containers with the worms in the soil, and then they sprayed some of them with glyphosate, and they were thinking that because they were killing those crops, there'd be a lot of dead plant material that would bring those worms to the surface because they'd want to eat it. Sure. They were anticipating that, and compared to the ones that didn't have the glyphosate, but it turned out the exact opposite. And what I think they found was that glyphosate was paralyzing those worms, so they couldn't make it to the surface. It was quite interesting that they pretty much stopped going to the surface after a certain amount of time because they got so poisoned that they couldn't move. And there was another study that showed specifically a Parkinsonian-like symptom in worms that were exposed. I think they were, I forget what kind of, I don't think they were earthworms, maybe roundworms, another kind of worm that was exposed to glyphosate and got Parkinson's-like symptoms, which again is a sort of neurological damage of the substantia nigra in the brainstem nuclei. So I think the glyphosate, it's been shown in multiple studies that it causes glutamate excitotoxicity. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's been, various groups have shown that. And so that's that's actually very much connected to autism as well, glutamate excitotoxicity. It means that it increases the glutamate receptor activity, which causes glutamate uptake into the cell, which then causes this excitatory response that causes oxidative damage through various, oxidizing agents that get expressed in response to that glutamate signal.
And you also think that this affects mood disorders, right? So I know we just talked about the serotonin effect, but is there other ways that the glyphosate can affect depression and anxiety?
Yes, well, of course, all of those hormones, serotonin and melatonin is another one that's of course very important for sleep. And melatonin, I believe melatonin is crucial for supplying sulfate to the brain so that it can clear garbage during sleep. It's quite interesting that one of the really important things that sleep does is to allow your neurons to recycle their waste materials. And so they need sulfate to do that. And melatonin is produced in the pineal gland in response to sunlight. And then it's packaged up with a sulfate. Each melatonin molecule gets stuck onto a sulfate, and the two of them get sent out together into the cerebrospinal fluid at night while you sleep. And so the melatonin is actually delivering sulfate to the neurons, which it needs in order to digest, in order to break down the debris. It's quite interesting. And the autistic kids have a huge problem with sulfate, and I talked about that a lot in my book. I think the sulfate dysfunction, the disruption of the sulfate system is the way I should say it, in the body is a major driver behind many of these neurodegenerative diseases and neurological diseases and the mood disorders. I think it's all connected to this sulfate problem.
What about glyphosate and hormones? You mentioned thyroid gets affected. The hypothyroid is so common. People think that you need a lot of carbohydrates for thyroid health. But I mean, what have you seen in terms of glyphosate with thyroid issues?
Absolutely. And that's, again, been shown in studies, and that's been shown in studies with pregnant rats, where you expose the rat to glyphosate during pregnancy. And then you look at the offspring and you can see that it's disrupted the thyroid system, the thyroid hormone in the offspring. Of course, this thyroid hormone, it comes out of the shikimate pathway. So you're going to have a deficiency in the hormone right there. And thyroid deficiency in the mother is linked to a 4-fold increased risk of autism in the child. That's in humans. So if a mother has thyroid deficiency, she has a much greater increased risk of producing an autistic child. So
wow,
yes,
I
I
never
think
knew that.
yeah. So that's very worrisome.
Wait, why is that? Why is that the risk of having thyroid imbalances relate to? I'm missing the line.
Well, yeah, exactly how that works, right? It's it's complicated. I'm not sure I have the answer. I think I've fussed with the answer here and there, but I'm not sure what the exact. That's a hard one to link up, actually, I think. But of course, thyroid does a lot with metabolism,
right?
And so when you have thyroid deficiency, you have a mitochondrial deficiency as well, and so that's connected to autism. So that could be a pathway by which it could happen.
Yeah, and a lot of the hormones in play. So I'm sure there's a lot of different ways that it can happen. In your book, you talk about vitamin A toxicity, and I love that you brought it up because I've been talking about that recently. There's a lot of carnivores that eat probably a bit too much of liver, which has a lot of vitamin A. But in your book, you mentioned vitamin A toxicity and the risk of damage to an unborn baby. Can you talk a little bit about that? And if we know that there is a risk of vitamin A toxicity, why is our government adding vitamin A to all of our foods?
That's so confusing, isn't it? And of course, I guess there's an association between blindness, right, and vitamin A deficiency. Yes. And they're creating this crazy genetic crop. It's a vitamin A soy, I think, a soy that makes vitamin A. Is that right? I forgot.
I know that they add vitamin A to a lot of food. So it's required by law to add it to milk. A lot of the dairies, it's added to a lot of our wheats. And now they recently passed a law where these food manufacturers no longer have to include the vitamin A amounts in the nutritional facts. So it's interesting.
They've actually backed off on it. Is that right?
Oh, so yeah, they used to require that vitamin A, the amounts on the label have to be noted, and they just removed it. So now newer packagings do not list the level of vitamin A.
Interesting.
But if we know
that's really strange. So they still require it, but they don't require that you say how much is in there.
Yes, but
that's disturbing.
Right. And if we know that we can get toxic from vitamin A, I would think that's one that we'd want to measure, but now they're removing it from the packages. So it's not required on the labels.
That's interesting. That seems wrong. Well, vitamin A is tricky. And in fact, it's extremely important in development, and it needs to be, it's expressed and then it's cleared, and then it's expressed and it's cleared, and it sort of changes the behavior of how the cells either migrate or proliferate or differentiate into particular things. All of that is orchestrated by this complex scene that takes place. It's miraculous during development, where there's critical timing issues as far as when to squirt that vitamin A in there and then to get rid of it, because now you've got to go on to the next stage and want to make it differentiate, because I think the vitamin A promotes proliferation. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you say, okay, we got enough cells here. We now need to differentiate into the thing we're going to become. And it can get totally messed up if that vitamin A doesn't get cleared. And so I mentioned glyphosate disrupting enzymes that metabolize toxics like the insecticides. There's a whole class of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, and they're super, super important for many things. One of them is to activate vitamin D. So we've got a massive vitamin D deficiency, I think, because of that. And one of them, as I mentioned, is to clear toxic exposures. Many of these fat-soluble toxins get cleared by these cytochrome P450 enzymes, but there's cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver that are critical for removing vitamin A, for breaking it down. And so when those are broken, vitamin A goes down other pathways and becomes toxic. So I think it's a problem of vitamin A plus glyphosate. Mm. And this is there was a paper by Carrasco, who was the lead author on a paper, probably multiple papers actually, that talked about teratogenicity, glyphosate causing defects, genetic defects in development in the embryo, and he linked it to vitamin A toxicity, and he blamed it on glyphosate suppressing the breakdown of vitamin A. So there's too much. So you can't get it right when you have a problem with the enzymes that break it down. That's the problem. So you can't, you either have too little or you have too much, because you can't control the timing in the right way.
Right, right. And that's where I think maybe for certain individuals that eat a meat-based diet that then eat a lot of liver, if they've been exposed to that damage in the P450 that you mentioned, they might not be able to clear the excess vitamin A or store it properly in their liver. And then it could actually cause the liver to get inundated. And it's just a higher risk because then you have too much vitamin A compared to the other fat soluble vitamins. And I've just seen a lot of people not do so well eating too much liver. And I think
that's interesting. And of course, liver is going to have a lot of toxic chemicals too, because it's famous for its ability to clear toxic chemicals. So it really grabs them out, as trying to keep them from getting into the general circulation. It's very good at that. So if your animal that made your liver is exposed to a lot of toxic chemicals, you are going to be also. I think liver is a fantastic food. It's so nutritious. It has so many different nutrients in it that are important for health. But it's a big but, because if the animal is being exposed to all these chemicals, that liver that you eat is going to have those chemicals in it. So you have to have a very healthy, you have to have your own chicken, feed it organic in order to be able to eat chicken livers, So I really enjoyed organic chicken livers, which we can get sometimes at Whole Foods. So I think liver is a very healthy food. But again, in the context of the problems, it's very interesting. Yes. I was looking at the fats, and I think you might find this interesting, because a lot of people say omega-6 fats are really bad, right? There's a whole, Mercola is a big one for that. He has a whole book on it. Omega-6 fats are bad. That's very, very interesting. And this, as you probably know, if you try to figure out what happens to omega-6 fats in metabolism, it gets really, really complicated, because there's all these different enzymes that turn them into different molecules that have various names, and some of those molecules are inflammatory. They cause an inflammatory response, and so I actually dug around long enough to start to get a sense of what's going on. If you look at arachidonic acid, which is a basic omega-6 fat, and arachidonic acid gets processed by cytochrome P450 enzymes and turned into an endogenous cannabinoid. It's a natural cannabinoid produced by the human body. And we have had so many people getting success with treating with cannabinoids to try to deal with all their problems, their pain, and their depression. I suspect that because of that blockage by glyphosate of the ability of converting arachidonic acid into this endogenous cannabinoid, the arachidonic acid gets diverted into other pathways with the COX enzymes and the LOX enzymes. Lipoxygenase is a big one. And lipoxygenase converts arachidonic acid into leukotrienes, and leukotrienes are incredibly inflammatory. So you're going to get an inflammatory liver instead of getting this endogenous cannabinoid, which is basically saying, hey guys, everything's great. We're really good. So I feel like there are these, I think vitamin D is an example of that too. It's so interesting because you have these super nutrients, like and cannabinoids I would consider to be sort of super nutrients that are produced by enzymes that are super critical for lots of other things. Sure. So I feel like the body actually uses those signaling molecules, the vitamin D and the cannabinoid, as an indicator that the cytochrome P450 enzymes are healthy. Mm-hmm. So when you can't produce those things, that's an indicator that they're not healthy. Right. In which case you've got to make a whole different metabolic policy around the fact that you don't have those CYP enzymes. And so that causes all this inflammation and stuff that we have so much trouble with. Because of the body's recognition that CYP enzymes are broken because it can't make those molecules.
And that, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying. I mean, I think our body just tries to, with whatever it has, make the best decisions. And sometimes we don't have the ideal situation, just like when estrogen breaks down into certain pathways as well, right? So it sounds like this is a very similar type of thing. And I remember in nutritional therapy school, they would say that certain omega-6s, they can turn pro-inflammatory. And so I didn't touch upon it as much as you just mentioned. And that is very interesting. And things get broken at the very cellular or, granular level, then things can start breaking down and your body will just try to do what it can. And so it really then matters what we put in our bodies. And I think that's where the food is so important. And talking about where we are sourcing these foods. It's not just about organics. When I was doing organic research, a lot of our organic foods are, especially the fruits, are brought in from other countries. Mm-hmm. And we don't even know if they're being mandated properly, right? So it's just, And so
Yeah,
sometimes
I'm
it's
sure
just,
there's some fraud in that, which is really scary. You think if I'm spending the extra money to get organic, I'm getting a good product, and you can't guarantee that.
yeah, no, absolutely.
It's frustrating.
So what do you think is a solution then?
Everything organic. Yeah, absolutely. We're very rigid about it in my family. We won't buy it if we can't find it organic. And then also high sulfur foods. I really, as I said, I focused on sulfur. And you need to straighten up the sulfate system. A lot of people have
Yeah,
sulfur sensitivities.
I was going to
I
just say
think,
that.
yeah, and that's because of glyphosate, because
Mm,
it's quite interesting. Glyphosate disrupts the enzymes that convert inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur in the form of the sulfur containing amino acids like methionine
right.
and cysteine. Those are super important, as you know, for glutathione. So glutathione deficiency is a very common problem with the autistic kids. And there's a direct relationship to glyphosate, because glyphosate disrupts the supply of methionine. And it also potentially messes up glutathione because there's glycine there too, that it's probably also messing up. But it's been shown experimentally that it reduces the amount of glutathione in the liver, and it changes glutathione to be highly oxidized. It isn't able to bring it back to the reduced form, which is the form that actually works as an antioxidant. And that's because the enzymes that do that are disrupted by glyphosate.
Right.
So you get a really big mess with insufficient antioxidant capacity, in part because of insufficient glutathione in the liver. And so eating sulfur-containing foods is important to me, as long as you don't have this problem. What happens actually when you can't turn the inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur is that you turn it into sulfite and hydrogen sulfide gas, and those are both troublesome. So you get the bloating from the gas, but the gas can also float up to the brain and cause brain fog. Hydrogen sulfide gas. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a whole group of people that do low sulfur diets, and and I get it because it makes you feel better. But the caveat should always be, or the disclaimer should always be, you can't do it long term. Otherwise, you're going to reduce the risk of producing more glutathione and helping you clear.
And the sulfate, which, as I said, is so important. It's really interesting biology, the biochemistry of maintaining the cycle between sulfate and hydrogen sulfide gas. There's oxidizing and reducing sulfur back and forth as which all along the way, the body makes use of those products in different complicated ways to make metabolism work. And so the sulfate is transported by those aromatic amino acids that are blocked. So you end up with a deficiency in the transport of sulfate from the gut to other parts of the body, including the brain. And that's part of the problem there too, is that you don't have those aromatics. So you can't transport as much sulfate. But even the enzyme that hooks the sulfate on, many enzymes in the sulfate pathway are disrupted by glyphosate. It's quite interesting. And so you end up with a sulfur deficiency problem because you start trying to do a low sulfur diet. I do recommend Epsom salts, and I do wonder whether people who have sulfur sensitivities also have sensitivities to Epsom salts. And I don't know whether you have the answer to that. I would hope not, just because it's not directly through the gut. You're still soaking in Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate.
There are some people that are sensitive. So there was like a magnesium spray I recommended, and I think it used some type of sulfur ingredient. So then what I ended up recommending is there's some type of, I forget what salt it is, but it's a form of creating the magnesium spray through some type of Epsom salt that doesn't have as much of the sulfur. And then people can tolerate, but it's still, a Band-Aid in a sense, right? You're just removing some of the sulfur exposure. But
you want the sulfate. That's the
thing.
That's why I like Epsom salts, because I know the magnesium, people usually think of Epsom salts as a source of magnesium, but they're also a source of sulfate.
Yes.
And so it can help with the sulfate deficiency problem.
And I tend to just work with my clients to say, okay, you can't tolerate anything related to sulfur, fine. For a temporary bit, let's just work on the gut. Maybe you can strengthen your gut, and then you can tolerate more sulfur. And then we slowly try to introduce, because people will say, I can't eat eggs because of the sulfur. And
right, I know. I've heard that. I got that immediately when I was talking about sulfur and how important. I would get email from people, I can't eat sulfur. Yep. I remember I was, oh my God, I didn't realize. And then I had to look into that. Yeah, I was going to say something else and I forgot. Oh, oxalate. I was wondering whether the people who have sulfur sensitivities, whether they often also have oxalate problems.
I haven't seen a one-to-one correlation. there's some people that are just seem to be really sensitive to oxalates. And I haven't seen that they would also be sensitive to eggs and other sulfur rich foods. So I wouldn't say that I've seen it's common, but I bet you there may be some. I mean, there's some people that are just sensitive to everything where their immune system is in a heightened response because something in their past triggered their immune system to now be in a heightened state and they cannot tolerate anything. And it's so unfortunate. It's so unfortunate.
Yes.
The other
thing I recommend is sunlight. I want to say that.
Sunlight, yeah.
I'm big on sunlight to the skin and to the eyes. And I actually think it's really bad to put sunglasses on a 2-year-old. I think that's a really bad idea.
Yeah. And I mean, we need sunlight to help, break down cholesterol and produce more vitamin D. And it's just good for so many reasons to be outside. And
right. It actually triggers the synthesis of cholesterol sulfate in the skin in addition to vitamin D sulfate. And it is a way to distribute sulfates throughout the body. But of course, glyphosate's disrupting those enzymes, and glyphosate's also disrupting melanin, which is the skin tanning agent. So that makes you more sensitive to sunlight as far as getting UV exposure and ending up with skin cancer. So glyphosate makes the sun risky. So you got to get rid of the glyphosate and then you can enjoy the sun. So it's all tied to the glyphosate. There's so many things that are problematic because of the glyphosate. And that includes the eyes as well. I mean, the glyphosate is messing up in the eyes what is in the eyes to protect them from sun damage. And the eyes actually depend upon the sun to stay healthy. But again, if you've got those enzymes disrupted by glyphosate, you end up with oxidative damage to the eyes from the sun because the enzymes aren't working. It's really a huge problem everywhere that the enzymes that would turn the source into something useful for you. But if they don't work, you get oxidative damage. That's a very big problem.
It's interesting. I mean, so it just goes back to if we just stick to real foods and the way that nature intended, we won't have these issues of the pathway that can be adverse to us. Instead, it'll go back to being beneficial. Have you seen a time frame where people just remove all things glyphosate in their life as much as they can, that they start improving their health?
Lots and lots of cases. I've gotten so many email. I get email from someone who says, I've got this problem. I think maybe glyphosate's causing it. And I'll recommend some things, like what I just said. Mm-hmm. And then they come back a year later and say, my God, it's just unbelievable how much that helped me. I have a lot of cases like that. There was one with his wife. She had interstitial cystitis, I think it was. Yes. And he said she had a terrible problem, couldn't fix it. He wondered if it was glyphosate. I said, I suspected it could be. She went on an organic diet and then a year later he got back to me, totally fixed her problem. Then he wrote a whole article on the web. And then someone else sent me email, said, oh, I saw his article. It's so fantastic. I want to get a hold of him. Can you give me his email address? Because I want to tell him how wonderful it was that it fixed my problem too. So I think there's a lot of people. And there was, there are people, it's also the other way where some painful things where the mother shared with me that she had grown her own tomatoes in her garden while she was pregnant, and she used glyphosate to control the weeds growing among the tomatoes. And then she ate a lot of those tomatoes, and then she had an autistic child from that pregnancy. It was very painful for her to share that with me.
Right. What are your thoughts on Bayer buying out Monsanto? Bayer is obviously a pharmaceutical. I know this is probably highly controversial. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think it's a pattern, right? The chemical industry, the agrochemical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry are one and the same. Mm-hmm. And it's a great system for them. I really think so. I think they know that as long as we keep the population poisoned, they're going to be very sick, and then they'll have to buy all of our drugs in order to keep themselves afloat. And we'll make tons of money both ways. So that what's not to like about that? I mean, I think we are so centered on making money at the expense of human lives. And I find that horrendous. I find it horrible. I just can't understand how people can sleep at night knowing that they're causing so much pain. This is something that really puzzles me, actually. No amount of money is worth it to know that you're causing so much pain in all of these human beings around the world. And yet these people seem quite content to do it. And to hide even, to conceal what's happening. So it's very sad. I hope that we will have a massive awakening when people will finally realize that this is just not the right solution. we need to overhaul our agriculture in a big way. And it's not just organic, renewable, sustainable, all those good words where people work towards fixing the soil. And then once you fix the soil, you actually fix a lot of other things as well. So I think we need to go back to the small organic farm. People need to eat whole foods. That's very important. Stay away from the processed foods. And then organic whole foods, I think, takes you a huge way towards a healthy lifestyle. And you will find the money you spend extra on the organic food, you're going to get back in spades when you don't get cancer, your child doesn't get autism. I mean, that is such a huge expense, let alone the pain of it all, that it's totally worth it to buy organic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my kids, they eat plants, I guess they eat mostly fruits, but then sometimes they'll have some, like leafy greens, but we only buy organic. So if it's not in season, because they're expensive, then we don't buy we don't buy strawberries unless it's like May through, I think, September, because that's when they're more affordable, when they're organic, and otherwise we're not getting them. And I think that's the way we're supposed to be eating them. They weren't
absolutely
supposed to be around all the time. I know that glyphosate is getting, Monsanto, glyphosate, Roundup, they're getting a bad rep finally in the press and stuff, but there's other products like atrazine and stuff. Does it make sense that there's other products out there, or, do they all kind of function the same?
They're very different in terms of their mechanisms of toxicity, but atrazine is probably, most people would say it's more toxic than glyphosate. It's very toxic. Okay. I think all the herbicides are very toxic in different ways. And I fear that it will be great. We'll finally get the message, glyphosate's toxic, we have to get rid of it. And they'll just switch over to 2,4-D or dicamba or atrazine or glufosinate, and they're all bad.
Yeah, when I did research for my book, atrazine was, I think atrazine was used right after glyphosate. So
they're switching from glyphosate to other things. And they've got this also glyphosate plus, right? So glyphosate plus dicamba in the Midwest, I think on the soy crops, and it's causing a huge problem. There's lots of lawsuits going on because you have to buy your soybeans that have 2 GMOs in them, one for glyphosate and one for dicamba. And then you buy this product that has both of those in there because the glyphosate is not clearing all the weeds or certain weeds that have developed resistance. And that's been a big problem. That's going to probably derail the industry as well, because they have to use more and more glyphosate to kill the plant because it's getting really resistant to glyphosate.
Yes.
And they reach a point when they can't kill the plant with glyphosate. Now they've got to bring something else in. And then the neighbor gets mad because the dicamba goes to the neighbor's yard and kills their crop because they don't have that dicamba resistance. You have to buy a crop with dicamba resistance defensively, even though you don't plan to use dicamba. That's really awful.
That is so scary. I think I always recommend if people want to eat plants, they should just grow their own naturally, even if the plants are really small and little, but that's probably the best way. So where can people find your book? This book is really good. It's not as super sciencey, so the layperson can understand it. I think it's really good. Where can people find this, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so I have a webpage, stephanieseneff.net, where I have some stuff posted there about my work, and then the book is available on multiple booksellers, including in the UK, the US. Amazon, of course, sells it. And then of course the books. Chelsea Green, the publisher, also offers the book for sale, so you can get it from multiple sites on the web.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. I first got introduced to GMOs because I took the trek from Los Angeles to Berkeley, and there's this big factory farm in that area. And I was just thinking, this cannot be right. And I started looking into GMOs back then, and that was early 2000s. And that's
so impressive. You're before me.
But everyone would say, but this is how we're going to feed the world. And so I kind of let it go. But intrinsically, I felt like something was wrong. And then my husband always says, I've come full circle because I always had this passion about GMOs, and then it came out. And now eating a mostly meat diet, it just makes sense why people are healing. For some of it, it's just the removal of glyphosate products in your life. And I think it's very interesting. So thank you for this book. I think it's really good. And I think people should, awaken. It's not just about eating only meat. There's a lot more to it, and why plant toxins is not just anti-nutrients. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys, I hope that this conversation with Dr. Seneff really opens your eyes about the dangers of certain things in our plant-based foods. I know that we want to think that plant-based foods are so healthy, but sometimes it's more than just the molecular structure of plants. Sometimes it's what we are actually doing to our plants. If you have access to farmers markets and you trust your farmer, or you can grow your own plants and plant-based foods without using these toxins, then that's probably the best way to introduce plants. I talk about this a lot more in Carnivore Cure, and make sure to pick up Dr. Seneff's book, Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killers Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment by Dr. Stephanie Seneff. This book is really good in explaining what is going on with glyphosate and all the disease and all these other areas that are being affected by glyphosate. You can also find her graphics that she talks about in my book in chapter 5. Okay, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you guys later. Bye, guys.